if we're going to overcome the impossible and see the miraculous, we must see God as the God of adequate provision. He's the God of adequate provision. Understand this. Even if Nehemiah could get to Jerusalem, you understand he's in Susa, he's miles away, hundreds of miles away. Even if he could get to Jerusalem and rebuild the city walls and restore its city gates, how would he pay for it? And who would help him? And how would this miracle come about? And so all these things are weighed upon Nehemiah as well. And really that, it's not really all that much of an uncommon concern. I mean, there are times when we face impossible situations and say, even if I could answer the call, how would I ever pay for that? And who would help me? And where are the resources? And what is going on? And most times the things that make a situation look impossible is that situation is beyond our reach. It's one of those things where we say, I don't have the answers, and we know that God's got to come in the scene. We look at the situation and see that we lack the necessary resources to do anything about the need that's before us, and we say, man, how can I do that? And I don't have the money to do that. And even if I had the money, I don't have the answers, or the people or know where to start. And the root of this is that in the fact that we are looking at ourselves and our own resources and not the God of adequate provision. The God of adequate supply. You know, I probably should stop here just for a moment and mention that I know that God is the God of more than enough. And he's the God of unlimited resources. That God is that all-sufficient one. That God is the God who lacks for nothing. He is the one that can create 1,000 hills and place cattle on it more than we could ever number. In him there is no lack and no limits. And he is more than able to do more than we will ever ask or think and meet the need in any given situation. But for our purposes today, I am saying that God is simply the God of adequate provision. You know, I remember when I was in Bible college and God had called me to the ministry and I was flat broke. We were broke beyond broke. I mean, we had nothing really to speak about. In fact, if you were to count all our money in our savings account in our pockets, we had all of $7. And I remember walking into the college that day and saying, listen, I believe that God has called me to the ministry and I want to start college here. And I see that your fees or whatever they were. And I said, and the dean of admissions looked across the desk at me and he said, and how do you plan on paying for this? And I looked back and I said, you know what? I really don't know how I'm going to pay for it. I can tell you this, I've got $7 in my pocket and I've got a call to the ministry. And I'm willing to step out and do what God has called me to do. And he said, well, listen, I believe you've got a call to the ministry. I'm willing to work with you. I'm going to make you sign a promissory note. It's going to have to be paid off in the next 90 days. I didn't have a job at that point in time. I mean, things were that bad. I had nothing to go on. And I just said, well, listen, I'm going to sign that note on faith, believing that God is going to meet the need. And I can remember coming down to that very first payment, that 30 days into this, and the payment was beyond anything. It didn't matter what it was. I had nothing anyway. You know, I'm coming down to this situation, and I'm saying, God, I've got a payment due here on Tuesday, and here it is Sunday, and I've got nothing to give this man. I signed with my word, and I've signed in faith, Lord God. I've got nothing to offer here. And I walked in. I remember walking into church, and Gail and I were sitting on this side of the sanctuary, in that little Mennonite church up there, and I was sitting there, and we were just praying and asking God to put his blessing upon this whole situation. There was an individual who walked up to me after service and said, just shook my hand and said, Tom, how are you doing? Went and reached out and shook my hand. It was one of those handshakes. You ever get one of those that has that paper in it? And I'm thinking, why is this man giving me his trash? And then I realized it's not trash. It's one of those Pentecostal handshakes, you know, you get where there's cash in it. I thought, that's not trash, that's cash. You know, and so finally I said, oh, you don't have to do this. I know we want to do this. It's the way God has always spoken to us this morning in our time. And I took that cash and I began to count it out. And it was a portion of what I needed for that Tuesday. And before that Sunday was over, that was Sunday, when payment was due on Tuesday. Before that Sunday evening was over, there was sufficient cash to meet the payment for Tuesday. Now let me just tell you, there wasn't extra. It wasn't one of those things where I had double the amount. There was adequate provision for what was before me. Sometimes there are times when we're looking for God to come and provide a miracle, and if God doesn't somehow, if we're needing maybe an insurance payment check, and we get that insurance payment check, we say, well, why wasn't there enough money there for groceries? Listen, God is a God of unlimited supply, but he simply meets the need adequately at the moment. It's that whole concept of what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. Give us our daily bread. He meets the daily need. So tomorrow we'll trust him again. And so what God was doing is he was doing this miracle in my own life. And what we got to see is that whenever we're facing impossible situations, God meets the need as the need arises. You might remember 2 years ago, I believe it was in July. It was, in fact, 4th of July weekend that we were still meeting in this school. We were, in fact, had been displaced out of the cafeteria and was placed over in the library. You might remember it was less than conducive worship facilities. We were kind of gathered together. We were a small body of believers because at that point in time it was not only the holiday weekend, but, we were all from that little set, and, a little section. And it was, to tell you the truth, I didn't like one bit of it, just to be frank. But we were there nonetheless, and God had spoken in our spirits about this particular facility, this land, and the opportunity to come here. And I stood there that weekend, and I said to our church that morning was less than 40 people. And I said, listen, church, I believe that God is going to give us a piece of property. It sits right up there on Clyde Morris Boulevard. And I believe that in the next 60 days, we're going to raise $60,000. That's what we need, $60,000 in the next 60 days. It was a faith walk. It was an impossible situation. It was beyond anything we could ever imagine. And you guys bought into that whole thing. You said, I believe we can do this. And you began to give and rally to that. And you know what? I was thinking about this past weekend, especially last weekend, since it was 4th of July weekend. I was looking back and I was thinking, you know what? 2 years ago, we were people on a mission because God had dropped faith in our hearts, believing against all odds that God would somehow provide. And guess what? We sit in this facility today because God was faithful to that which he had placed before us, which was an impossible situation. I want you to know this. When you face impossible situations, God is a God of adequate provision. He will come and help you along the way. So what Nehemiah is facing is much the same. As Nehemiah makes his appeal before the king for a leave of absence, he comes before them and he comes before the king and he says, King, I've got to be leaving. I know I got responsibilities here, but I feel in my heart a need to go to Jerusalem. And I feel a need in my heart to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city. And so with this burden in his heart and the desires upon him, he has this holy boldness. He asks the king for letters to ensure safe passage on his way and for adequate lumber and provisions to do the job facing him. He's saying, listen, King, I need resources. I need finances. I need lumber to rebuild those walls, those gates. And I need blacksmith who will kind of refashion those hinges. And I need quarry people who know how to quarry rock. And God, King, I need all the things that will be necessary to build this city. And he makes that bold request before the king. And watch the response of Nehemiah. Watch the response of the king as Nehemiah says, because of the gracious hand of my God, because it was upon me, the king granted my request. Don't miss those words. God provided through a king. The king granted my request and also sent army officers and cavalry with me as well. You talk about God making a way. God was making a way for Nehemiah. And that which was needed was being provided miraculously. And that which seemed impossible was already becoming possible. God working out his plan. So let me just say to you, as we face the impossible, we need to stop looking at that which we have or don't have and start looking at what God can provide. And I understand this because I shared with you our own financial need. I'm not necessarily in a panic about that because I know that God is our source. The truth is this: if you can provide the necessary resources that make that situation that stand before you, then the situation is not impossible. The outcome is not a miracle. If you can say, I see the need, I'm just going to open my wallet and help meet the need, then guess what? It's not miraculous. God is simply using your resources. It's when God calls something together out of nothing and the impossible takes on possibility that we see the miracle working hand of God at work.